Thanks for joining this class. My name is John Kusav, I'm a sound designer, and I'm going to take you through a scene of my most recent project, Like Lambs. In this course, we're going to look at analysing a scene, the way the session is set up. We'll also be looking at foley and sound effects, as well as some basic editing techniques to sync and crossfade between audio regions. We will also be looking at dynamics and basic techniques in mixing, EQ and panning, and finally recording the mix down. I've supplied this Pro Tools session as part of this course. Please feel free to open it, remix it, re-edit it, use your own sounds, go as far as you like, and by all means please upload it and hashtag LikeLambs so that I might be able to find it and I'll leave a comment. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the course. So, before we do anything, we should definitely watch the video together, get acquainted with the material we'll be working with throughout these tutorials, and get a sense of the types of sounds we were needed, and just do a little bit of basic analysis and start to think about things from a very, very creative perspective before we look into any of the technicals. So, without further ado, let's watch the clip for Like Lambs. So here,
I can't.
one of the girls drops an item, a golden item, which you can see here.
I can't.
Missing footsteps as well as the girls are running away. Missing footsteps of the character as he approaches. And I think often the microphone on location just doesn't pick up a lot of details like footsteps, particularly if they're walking slowly. But dramatically, we may want to add them. And we'll discuss that a little bit later. The door opening was extremely quiet and quite probably reflective of what that door naturally sounds like. Not particularly cinematic, but let's keep moving.
You are not allowed in.
And there we heard him, this character over here, screaming his lungs out, but relatively he was quite quiet compared to probably what we would want him to sound. And this character over here, he steps into the frame and
You are not allowed in.
and speaks lines on what seems to be the same audio track as the other guy screaming. So that's a little problem we need to look at a little bit later as well. There's the natural door sound that was recorded on the day. And there we have the quiet sound of him climbing up the stairs. The door makes almost no sound at all as it opens. Quiet footsteps.
There's almost no money left, Charlie. Just the houses.
Okay, so that clip is quite typical of what you might get from a picture editor. It's got the original sound that was recorded on set, the dialogue, and some little bits of effects like the door closing, which were all captured by the microphone on set. Now obviously the track is really naked. We're going to be looking at ways to bring more life to all of that action. And I think the first thing that we start with really is foley, and thinking about the types of sounds we would love to include in there. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with foley, foley is any human movement sound. Hands, feet, the sound that fabric makes, the sound that props make as we handle them. And foley is recorded in a foley studio, typically by a foley artist, whose job it is to watch the videos and perform the movements at the same time as the characters. And that basically gives the characters weight, it creates a lot of texture, and it also, in a weird way, directs the eye if you use the sound of footsteps moving this way, the eye will naturally travel with those speakers and see where that character's going, and so on. And so I don't do my own Foley. I would typically start this process by creating a list of things that we need. And so just watching back the video, there's the handling of the jewellery, there's the dropping of the jewellery on the ground, there's the girls storming away, there's the character walking towards the door, there's the handling of the door, there's the approach of the guy, the older guy that closes the door on him, there's all the rustling and movement and chaos that's going on the hospital bed. There's the sound of the running up the stairs, walking in through the room, and the character by the window is smoking and seems pretty distressed. Now that we have an idea as to the type of Foley that we're going to need to fill the scene, the next area is to think about the backgrounds or atmospheres. What is happening in the atmosphere in this scene? What do you want the audience to feel, and how can we get them there? Now, of course, music is an option. You know, you get the right kind of music that carries the right kind of emotion, and it carries a scene and it fills it out. As a sound designer, often the challenge is finding ways to convey musical ideas or emotional ideas in the sound design without resorting straight to music. And so a little later on in the tutorials, we'll show you the solution that we had for that. But before we get onto that, in this next lesson, we're going to be looking at setting up a session to make sure that all of our routing and all of our tracks are in order so that we can start getting creative and start exploring ways to really bring this scene alive. So let's take a closer look at the session. This next part assumes some rudimentary knowledge in Pro Tools already, a basic understanding of how to create tracks, how to route tracks, and understanding of busing. There are a number of tutorials that you could look up these fundamentals if these concepts are new to you, but hopefully by the end of this explanation, and also when you see the supplied files, this session will be supplied as part of this class. You'll be able to go in there and have a look and see how the things have been set out. And so without further ado, let's take a look at the session. Over here, we have the video track, and beneath it, we have a guide track, which we've set to mute. Now, a guide track is typically supplied with the videos from the editor. Gives you a good indication as to what the director and the editor were thinking about when they set up the basic tone and the mood of a scene. But we've got that set to mute because we've got all of our lovely tracks down here, which we will go through in just a moment. Because this is a stereo session, we've got everything routing through a stereo master bus, which has a limiter on it, and I've just dipped the limiter down to minus 0.08. It'll keep the track loud, but it will catch any loud sounds from peaking out our master recording and causing the track to clip. Now, beneath that, we have our dialogue tracks. Here we have ADR, which is any recordings that we did after the fact to either enhance a line or to replace a line that wasn't recorded clearly, or to add lines to increase the drama of the scene. And we'll take a closer look at those a little later on. Beneath that, we have our dialogue tracks, which were recorded on set, and those have been routed into a dialogue stereo bus, which we have down here. These are our Sebastian tracks, and Sebastian is the character who's screaming on the bed, and I've just gone through and created some additional reverby tracks to enhance the sound that we have, and those are routed into the Sebastian bus down here, which gives us a little bit of separate control of the volume of those embellishments. Music tracks, which are also routed into a music bus, and as you can see, these are left blank because we did not use any music in this scene. By all means, add your own music and fill these tracks in any way that you like. I've just got them there because you typically have those tracks in a mix session. Here we have our sync effects, which are also routed into their own sync bus, and sync effects are any sound effects which were recorded on the day with the dialogue, and we separate them from the dialogue because when you deliver to, say, foreign markets, if they want to replace the English dialogue with whatever native language of that country, you typically just want to be able to delete the dialogue tracks and still have, all of your main sound effects in place. And that's why we separate those. Now, beneath those, we have our mono sound effects tracks, and these are different sound effects that we've used to embellish the scene, and we'll take a closer look at those in a moment, and a stereo track over here. These have all been routed into a stereo bus called effects, and as you can see, we've done a slight bit of voluming there, which affect all of these globally. Beneath that, we have our foley tracks, and here we have cloth movements, footsteps, spots, which are any smaller details like the door handling and the hands and the body in the bed, and other little embellishments, which are all routed into this foley bus over here. And then beneath that, we have our background sounds. We have some winds and some room tone, which were recorded on the day, and some other little bits of howling winds, which have all been routed into this Atmos BGs track. And BG, of course, stands for backgrounds. We have a sub-bass track here, where we have a 50 hertz tone, which is just a flat sine wave of a very deep rumble, which we feature throughout this film to build tension, and that's also routed into its own sub-bus. And then, as you can see over here, there are no background tracks for the first half of the scene, and this is because, as part of the concept for this particular film, we used a lot of the recordings that NASA made of different planet sounds. We wanted to give each individual character their own zodiac signature, and using the planets and the sounds that they make basically guide, build, and dissipate tension where required. And we have these Space Jam tracks over here, which have been routed into the space bus over here. And as you can see, we've given this a little bit of a volume graph movement, which basically builds and declines depending on the tension that we want to experience. If we go up here to the I/O, we can take a closer look at how the buses have been set up. So we have dialogue, Sebastian, music, effects. We have a Walla track as well. Walla is typically background talking and crowd effects and things, which we didn't use in this sequence, but that bus exists just in case we want to dial it up. And then we've got the master output.
So now that we've taken a close look at the session and the number of tracks and the routing in that session, let's have a look at the tracks themselves and see the type of content that we recorded and designed to build the scene. Now that we've had an overview of the entire session and the layout and the routing, let's take a closer look at the tracks themselves and learn about some basic editing techniques.
So to start, why don't we solo just the dialogue tracks, and that's permanently soloed there on the bus. And the way we've done that is by clicking Command click, which guarantees that we'll get signal flow coming through there from these tracks. Over here, our ADR tracks, we've had to ADR quite a few lines. Let's have a listen to those.
I can't.
Quick, grab his arm. Jesus Christ! Quick, get the needles.
There's almost no money left, Charlie. Just the houses.
Okay, so as a creative preference, we chose not to use a recording studio to do our ADR, but rather looked for domestic environments which had a similar sort of tonal quality. Of course, it's a preference. Some people prefer to record their tracks clean and affect them afterwards with reverb or what have you. But we went for very naturalistic sounds. So they're not the cleanest recordings, but tonally, we felt that they were more appropriate and they fit a lot better within those spaces. Beneath this, we have our dialogue tracks that were recorded on the day. Now, a real technical challenge that was posed in this scene
is where we see a teacher come to the door and tell the star that he's not allowed in here. Now, unfortunately, that was recorded at the same time that the character in the background was screaming, and so we have them both coming out at the same time. Let's have a listen to just that track, that section of that track.
You are not allowed in here.
And so rather than, I guess we looked at ADRing that moment, but decided against ADR because ultimately the performance was so strong, I think, from both of them, that it would compromise one or the other. And because the screaming was basically done in this one take, we really didn't want to cut away from it. And so, obviously wherever possible you would go for intelligibility. But we felt that in this scene, the intention was being conveyed strong enough in his face, from whatever words you caught of his in that moment. The fact that he closes the door on the character that's peering into a room where he clearly shouldn't be. And so because the message of the moment was communicated, we compromised a little bit on the intelligibility. You can make these choices. I think, there's a lot of debate as to, intelligibility versus the emotion you're trying to convey with the scene and how to get about that. Immediately following that, we have a second track. There were several microphones that we used to record this character's screaming, Sebastian's screaming. And so we took a different perspective of the microphone and added it immediately under that so that they would play together to create a new space. We tried to create a number of perspective shifts of the screaming. Here, with the girl speaking, the perspective of approaching a sound, and I think, objectively speaking, perhaps that sound would be quite similar, but because you're guiding an audience through an experience, you can really start to play with what they hear and how much they hear. Then there was this moment over here, which really the focus should be on this dialogue. And then the close-up, where we start to enter the headspace of the character that's screaming. And obviously this will be the most present part of the track, which carries us through to the end of that scene as he runs up the stairs. For this section, we created some special Sebastian effect tracks. And these obviously have been routed into their own bus and into the dialogue. And the reason why we're keeping this all together in the dialogue is because when, say, that foreign market does purchase the film, having those additional effects tracks will ultimately be redundant because the actor they will have to play, say, the Japanese Sebastian will be of a different voice characteristic than the actor that we have in this scene. And so we've kept those tracks together so that they could be removed together. Now let's just have a listen to these Sebastian effect tracks. And then again, they start over here. Okay, so this first lot of tracks we use to create a texture. Also we've added a big fat reverb, which makes the sound come out of a dream space a bit more. It sort of takes into account the physicality and the distance from the character, and so as we approach, we cut to a much cleaner signal, so that he becomes way more present. He's not a distant idea, a memory, something that's like seeping into your subconscious, but rather a very, very real event with a very, very real source sound. And playing with this idea, as Charlie runs up the stairs, we can continue to hear him reverb. Now, I mean, there is no real physical explanation for this. I mean, you can say that maybe the sound is in the distance and, you know, echoing up the halls. But really, we were more interested in this idea of the sound remaining with him, that he has seen this very, very traumatic thing. With the sync effects, as described earlier, these are the sounds which we cut out of the recording. These include things like the doors, which we could listen to by soloing over here. I try and find sounds from the location, and so if ever possible, you know, try and gain access to wherever they recorded the film and grab as many of those sounds as possible. Or if you're lucky to be brought on before they start shooting, it'd be great to talk to the sound recordist who will be there on the day to ask for any or all sound assets, light switches, door handling. They become extremely useful, particularly if they're recorded in the same space where they're depicted in the film. And then over here we have the jewelry dropping sound, which we took straight from the dialogue track. So moving on from the sync effects, we have our mono effects over here. Let's have a little listen to these. And then this has obviously been set. Okay, here we go. And so as you can see, these are just a series of wood creaks. The wood creaks appear throughout the film, basically gives the building a bit of personality, gives the track a bit of movement and a bit of detail. Now, as you can see, we didn't use any sound effects in this first part of the scene. And the reason for that is that Foley played a very, very big role in the creation of the sound design, where we have so many different details. And so I'm going to play this track with just the Foley to give you a sense of the level of detail and coverage that we would typically give to this. Let's have a listen. Okay, and so beneath that, let's take a look at these BG tracks. Now these are for the second scene, where we go into the room. I think on a more emotional level, what the wind sound captures, particularly a howling wind, is loneliness and the feeling of being in a desolate situation. And here is a boy that's just lost all of his money and is experiencing a certain level of emotional hollowness. And by choosing these types of hollow sounds, you know, even if not physically accurate, emotionally, I think it speaks to what the character is feeling and how they're reacting. And over here, we've also got two room tone tracks. We have, which we recorded from set. A room tone is a really good way to ground a space and to keep it nice and domestic. And it's that, for those reasons, the reasons why we use it there. Now, moving on from that, we have our big fat bass track. And I'm not sure if you could hear this through your laptop speakers, but it sounds a little something like this. bass is typically the hardest frequency range, your lower frequencies are your hardest range to control in any mixing environment. They're typically going to be the sound that gets cut from a lot of smaller domestic speakers or embellished in living rooms that have absurdly overpowered subwoofers or whatever. And so, some restraint is required when using any kind of bass tone, and particularly when you use a sine wave like this, you have the added problems of standing waves and when certain frequencies in a room collide with one another, they subtract each other, and then you get, a big hole in the sound frequency. A good trick when dealing with frequencies like this is to put them through your left and right channels, because I think what a lot of people don't realize is at the front of the theater are 3 full range speakers. And so there's this temptation to put everything in the subwoofer, but without really guaranteeing or having any idea how that subwoofer, not knowing how that subwoofer has been calibrated, it's much less riskier to channel those into the left and right speaker. And for the majority of this film, this is exactly what we did. And indeed, working with a stereo session for the purposes of this class, it's not really that much of a concern because we're routing those into our left and right anyway. Then we have the space tracks. Let's have a listen to these on their own and get a sense of the types of sounds we've used and how we've used them. And so here we use these sounds to basically ride the tension. You can have a look at these sounds separately in the supplied session to get a even closer look at the session. But let's just talk about things in terms of the emotional build of the scene. So here we have devastation. And so we just have a big, thick drone. As the girls go, there's curiosity, what's through that door? We have a reveal. And so we crescendo back up with more pressure level. And then as we go in for the scream, because the screaming is so loud and taking up so much of the frequency band, a lot of these space sounds were pulled out of the way to create a bed. And then over here, you can see that that emotional line has also been graphed in the output of the bus. Starting out strong, dipping down drastically for the big scream, and then tapering out, taking us to the end of the scene. Okay, so they are all of our tracks in more detail. In the next class, we're going to look at some basic editing techniques to get you started. For this next class, we're going to have a closer look at some of the core foundations behind sound editing, specifically syncing audio, using crossfades and other fades, and layering. As you can see, our effects tracks are quite minimal. This is for 2 reasons. The first is because I guess there weren't that many sound effects events in the scene that would be, typical of a much larger session. And also because I'm a big believer in specificity. What separates often a good sound design from a not so good one is that every sound has its place and that every sound punches. And early on in my career, I tried to make my sounds bigger by adding more and more sounds. But ultimately, what that does is it clutters up a track. It removes focus from any defining sound. It creates a bit of a mixing nightmare because now you have lots of sounds all vying for a limited frequency bandwidth. And more often than not, you lose a lot of the focus and a lot of the punch when you layer on sound too thickly. Clarity is everything, and every sound you use must have a very, very specific reason why you've used that sound to ultimately help the story. And here, to do that, we have our basic sync effects, which we had a look at earlier, which are the door closes and the drop of the jewelry. And then over here, we have all of our wood creaks. Beneath that in the Foley tracks, obviously the layering becomes a little more intense. But even then, you could see that each of these, man holding down, nurse, nurse too, are sounds which specifically link to different events or people in the frame, and giving us the freedom to, as they were recorded as separate tracks, to mix between them and choose where to place the focus. And for this scene, all focus is on Sebastian and his screaming. And so even though a lot of tracks were recorded, the way that they were used were ultimately to create movement and detail around the core sound. But the focus, the very focus of this scene, is the sound of Sebastian screaming, and therefore everything else sort of took a back seat to that. With regards to syncing audio, again, there are many techniques to do this. It's my preference to drop into grid mode, which when you zoom into a track, which we do by pressing Option and using the scrolly wheel on your mouse, you see every individual frame of the film. And so in the event of the door close, we can go by going frame by frame. So that's the frame where the door is closed. I put in a marker by using the enter button on the Apple keyboard and enter. And then we see the transient of the sound, which is a little bit off, and we move that over until it snaps. To give you more freedom, you can move into slip mode, which means the movements of the regions are not dictated by the frames themselves. And so if we sync that up, let's have a little listen. Let's zoom out a little bit.
You are not allowed to.
Looking at the types of crossfades and fades that we've used. Now, each fade serves a specific purpose, and let's take a look at those now. So, you add a fade by selecting the area that you would like to fade up or down from, and then pressing Command F brings up this window over here with the fades. Now, if you select Standard Equal Gain, you get these fade options over here. And without going into too much detail, the more the incline, the more rapidly the sound goes down. This being the quickest tail down, this being the most gradual. And there is the equal power, where we can start to use S-curves, which start the sound louder and then quickly taper it down. Now, there are no rules at all when using fades. I think a lot of people will tell you that there are, or they'll give preferences as to certain fades that achieve certain things. In reality, it's experimentation which will ultimately dictate the choices you make with fades. Sometimes you want something to come up really quickly and loudly, other times you want them to taper down. In either which way, it's very good sound practice, even if you're not using an overt fade that cuts through a sound, to fade all of your regions up and down. And the reason for this is to avoid clipping. Sometimes if you cut a sound off mid sound wave, it can cause a distracting click. And so to avoid that, it's best to top and tail all of your effects with a fade, even if it's a tiny one. Okay, so another area of this sound design which demonstrates the use of fades quite well is down here in all of the space recordings. Now, as you can see, we've got very long fade downs happening there, which basically is my way of saying that I'd still like to basically hear the essence of this sound over here, but without the full impact where we leave this totally open. Other sounds are just cut, slammed short. Because the door close was such a loud sound, it created the perfect opportunity to ditch other sounds beyond a certain point, and that's why that one's been cut so short. Here we have an S-curve where we want it to be loud. Because this sound over here was picking up in intensity, that sound goes down. And again, with specificity, even though there are so many tracks here, you can see that these tracks over here are filling up a hole left behind by these tracks, which have all been faded down or stopped. This is a track that fills out like a middle region, which is part of the transition between the tracks that we've stopped here and the ones that continue out. And then as far as what happens by the time we get to the end of the scene, there are only really this track remaining at full volume, and then these other ones which are fading down. And in this way, so much of the mixing happens in the edit, just by choosing what sounds appear when, and then so you create as many holes and opportunities for other sounds to be heard. If we were to just play all of these sounds across the entire scene, it would definitely cloud things up, causing the track to be muddy. So let's take a closer look at mixing in the next class, where we will look at dynamics, EQ, and panning. So now that we have all of our dialogue and Foley and all of our sound effects layered up and presented nicely, we now need to start thinking about mixing, or the varying volumes, dynamics, and spatial relationships of each of those sounds. Dialogue is always king. You always want to have your dialogue loud, intelligible, and present, and as clean as possible. Foley, the human body movements, are really good for grounding your character and really emphasizing certain movements. For example, a gentle pat on the shoulder in real life may make very little sound, but in a film, if that pat on the shoulder means everything to that character in that moment, that will play out as one of the loudest sounds in the film. Foley allows us to direct the audience's attention. It allows us to think about like where certain sounds are coming from, gives characters weight. That's not to say that we play all the Foley loud all the time or quietly all the time, but there's a lot of mixing potential, dynamics potential, as to how loud we make those sounds in any given event. In the case of background sounds, again, there are very little rules. Because the scene is so intense, we're going to drive it pretty hot and really build. But then when we move into the next room, which is a desolate environment where somebody confesses they've lost all their money, we take all those sounds away and bring it into a very quiet scene. By doing that, you create intimacy so that every word and every bit of Foley in that space is felt, and therefore we are more connected with our characters. So let's take a little bit of a look at the session again and look at some of the mixing options that we have, and I'll give you guys some basic guides to getting the most out of your track through mainly EQ and panning. Sound mixing is really all about dynamics, both in terms of the dynamics of the quietest sounds to the loudest sounds, but also in terms of the frequencies you're using and trying to think about sound in terms of low frequencies, your bass sounds, your mid frequencies, and then your high frequencies, your treble sounds, and ways that we could use as much of that range as possible without cluttering or heavily loading any one area of the frequency bandwidth. Now, with any mix with dialogue in it, dialogue is always king. You really want your dialogue to be heard, upfront, and present. And so let's just take a look at our dialogue tracks again, including the Sebastian tracks, and we'll just solo all of those and listen to how it plays out on its own without effect.
I can't.
allowed in.
There's almost no money left, Charlie. Just the houses.
Okay, so there are a number of issues which popped up while we just listened to that. Firstly, let's talk about levels. Generally speaking, we kind of want the volume to be at the very top of the green and moving into the yellow. That's on the louder end of a comfortable listening level. The moment your dialogue is hitting up here in the upper oranges or even into the reds, you're pushing dialogue way too hot and it will play very, very loudly. So right from the onset,
Can't.
if you listen to these first lines, we have a peak straight away. And so let's just audition that sound on its own. This peak over here is the sound of her cry, and then it's the sound of Sebastian yelling immediately after that. So by pressing Option and minus, we get to see our graph, our volume graph. So if we zoom in a little bit, we can pull that down by creating a breakpoint on the line and then pulling the volume of that event down a little bit. Let's hear that again.
I can't.
It's a little better. Still a little hot maybe. Let's bring it down just a fraction more. And have a
I can't.
Well, so I'm pretty happy with that. You could still hear her cry, but it's not, the loudest sound in the entire film. Moving right on, you can see over here, the screaming is pushing our master right to the top. I mean, and if the limiter wasn't there, we would probably be hitting red. That's a deliberate decision, because this is such a climactic, intense part of the film, and because the next scene plays so quietly, we felt that there was an opportunity there to basically break a couple of rules and just slam the volume to the roof. You have to be careful whenever doing anything like that to make sure you're not clipping. And sometimes, you might be clipping your dialogue bus. Like, let's just have a little look. It's just hitting all the way up there. So by the time it's routed back into the master, you're getting a clipped channel that's coming into your master, which we're now bringing down. Now, of course, classic rules would dictate that you would want to prevent that from happening before hitting the master. But for this track, we really embrace distortion. And there are a number of times when we use distortion as a creative tool, because there is something so repellent about distortion that really pulls us into our seats and has us, going for our ears, covering them. And so to highlight that horror, in this scene particularly, we decided to embrace the distortion. Now, typically, hitting red is okay, provided it's not going to end up on your final track, which will basically be stopped at tech check for being too loud. And the way that we prevent that, of course, is by placing a limiter on the track. Now that dialogue is roughly where we want it to be, we could then go and build the rest of the scene and the rest of the sounds of the scene around the dialogue. And so, again, there are no real rules, and different scenes require you to address things differently. If something is music driven, you'll have a very different sound approach to the mix than if it was more atmosphere driven or more foley driven. So let's cut forward and have a look at how we've used busing for mixing. So I've gone through and I've mixed all of the sync effects, and foley to roughly accommodate and sit in and around the lines. You'll see where lines are spoken, sound effects are dipped down, and where there are other opportunities, such as when he's running up the stairs, over here, where we can play out the sounds, everything in place. You could then grab all of those sounds and reduce their final output. And here we made the decision to lower all of the foley as he goes into the room. Every element of foley that you add to a scene is going to give movement to a track, and we really wanted all of the movement in this scene to come from the wind, which is why if we go to our wind tracks over here, even though it looks like they're playing quite quietly, because they come from a much louder source, they fill up this entire place, which is left wide open for them by bringing our other tracks down. And again, with the space tracks, once we went through and decided on the basic volumes of everything, making sure we dip down for moments where other sounds are needed to feature, such as here at the peak of the door close, we pulled everything out just to give that door close a bit of extra punch, because a lot of the sound frequencies from this track, for example, if we just play that on its own, it's a very thick, heavy sound, which would have dominated and taken up way too much of the frequency bandwidth for the door, which we really just wanted to cut through everything and slam, because it's a major story point at that point in the sound design. And again over here, where you're mixing against the fade, no rules at all. This was cut this way because we kind of wanted it to taper away, and then in the mix we then mixed it differently again, and then coming out finally through the final effects bus. Once we got the basic relationships of all of these volumes to sound a certain way, once we had the instrument tuned the way we wanted it, we then take that instrument and dip it in and out, depending on how we require it, both for the story, the different sound events that we want to punch, and also just to carry the emotional line that those tracks take. So once we have all the volumes in roughly where we want them to be and the track is starting to sound okay, the next thing to consider is panning. That is, whether the track is coming from the left or from the right, or if it's dead center. Now, the general rule for panning dialogue is to keep it dead center. In this example, being a stereo track, that means when you pan center, it will come out of both speakers. And just to take a look at the pans, you can click over here and select pan, and it gives you a line, the middle being the center, and then off center on either way is left and right. The only time we really panned any of the dialogue was over here. As the girls walk to the right of the screen, we also sent their dialogue with them. This is also true to the foley of their footsteps, which also follows a very similar path to the left side of the screen. Dynamically, how this works is it allows us to move them and their sounds out of the way, so that when Charlie approaches, and let's have a look at his pan over here, when he approaches from the left of the screen, as they are exiting to one side of the frame, then the balance of the shot, the balance of the sound design, is picked up on the other side. Let's have a listen to that soloed.
If you have access to a control surface or a mixing desk, you could also automate your pans or your volume moves by first arming a track, setting it to touch under the waveform window over here, and then finding the corresponding track on your surface, playing the section that you want to affect,
I can't.
And then making your moves, both with the volume and the pan. Now that we've had a little bit of a look at the basic fundamentals of mixing and panning, I encourage you guys to definitely just experiment with those. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer when it comes to this stuff. It all just depends on the level of realism you're trying to achieve and how you're trying to connect your audience and where. So lastly, let's take a look at EQ. Now, the two main reasons to use EQ is to correct a problem in a sound. In this way, we take away frequencies that we don't want to hear. Or alternatively, to think about the general bandwidth of a sound and what it is that we're taking from a sound. For example, if you only want the rumble from a sound, you get rid of everything else so that you're just left with the frequencies that you want. By being selective about the frequencies of each sound, by interrogating every sound and go, why are you here? Oh, you're here to create a little bit of glistening or a little bit more bass or a bit more mid-range. Then by removing all of the unwanted frequencies from that sound gives your track more room to breathe and allows you to add more. For the purpose of this exercise, we're going to have a look at this line over here, which I think needs a little bit of EQ help. Let's listen.
There's almost no money left, Charlie. Just the houses.
Now, to my ear, houses has way too much of what we call sibilance. And so I want to take away some of the frequencies that are creating that problem in the audio. So one way to do this is to select the region and copy and paste it immediately below by pressing Control Option, click and drag. And we're going to mute that track. We go to the audio suite, EQ, and so for this example, we will be using the Q2 mono plugin. And
there's almost no money left,
sound
Charlie.
To have a listen.
Just the houses. There's almost no money left, Charlie. Just the houses. There's almost no money left, Charlie.
So
Just
once
the
we
houses.
find the offending frequency,
There's almost no money
we
left,
press
Charlie.
Control and
Just
dip
the
it down.
houses. There's almost no money left, Charlie.
And that
Just
way,
the houses. There's almost no money
much
left,
happy with
Charlie.
that. We click Render, remembering that our old track is still there if we need it, and then we play the scene
There's
again.
almost no money left, Charlie. Just the houses.
And that sounds much better to my ear. Of course, you can spend a lot more time on it and get right into the frequencies and listening to every aspect of it, but it's just a rough guide to EQ. That's the basic principle. So now that we've mixed the track and we're happy with how it sounds, let's have a look at how to record it back down into a stereo audio file so we could put it back onto the video. Now, the easiest way to do this, let's just move this out of the way, is to set your in and out points up here by dragging and selecting, and that is just about right. Or you can just click on the source video, which will automatically give you your in and out points to be flush with that. In the event where you have sounds trailing longer than picture, for whatever reason, we can just press Shift and then extend the out point. Or you can just grab it and drag it. Once we've worked out our in and out points, we go to File, Bounce to Disk. Here we can choose our file type. Let's go with AF for this. Our format, whether we want it to be a mono track or multiple mono, which is two separate audio files left and right, or interleaved, which is one stereo track. The bit depth, the sample rate, I tend to convert during bounce. You can import after bounce, which will bring the track that we're about to bounce out straight into this session, but we won't do that here. And then we click bounce. I've set up a folder called Bounced Tracks where we will put all of our recordings, and let's call this Like Lambs Sound with the date, just so that you can track your progress, or if you need to go back you can know which one is the latest from the date that's printed into the track, and save. This will commence bouncing from there it is, and here we go.
I can't.
You are not allowed in.
When you export this way, you'll hear the track playing, which will give you the opportunity to hear your mix down to make sure it's all good while it's bouncing.
Thank you so much for joining me on this course. There are additional educational resources I'd love to tell you about. designingsound.org and Soundworks Collection are both brilliant online resources for further learning in film sound. For sound effects, freesound.org offer royalty-free sound effects to your heart's content. Just make sure you check the licensing before using it on any commercial project. And I also encourage you to check out Soundly, which is a wonderful bit of software which interfaces with other libraries and helps you archive your own, and is also connected to freesounds.org. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to hearing your remixes.